What was the very first piece of knowledge God taught to Adam and Eve? At the time, Adam knew nothing about God or the universe in which he was made. His mind was blank. So what was it that God began to teach him first at the very beginning? Today on the Trumpet Daily, we travel all the way back to the very beginning of human civilization.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. We were born into this 21st century world as it is, and most of us just take that for granted. We can't really explain why this world is the way it is, and the reason for that is because few people have ever gone back to the beginning to see how it all got started. But if you had a time machine to take you back to the very beginning of human civilization, wouldn't you want to see it? Well, we don't have a time machine, but we do have the Holy Bible, God's instruction book for mankind. And in that manual, God tells us how this civilization got started and why the world is the way it is today. Let's begin today at the very beginning in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." In the very beginning, there was this beautiful creation, and while Lucifer and the rest of the angels were obedient to God's law of love, everything was organized, everything was beautiful, everything was improving and getting better over time. But notice verse 2, it says, "And the earth was without," or that word "was" means became, the earth became without form and void. So something happened to this earth. It became in a state of waste and decay or confusion and empty, as those two Hebrew words mean. The earth became without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So this happened because of the rebellion of Lucifer and the third of the angels that were under his direction. Once they rebelled and fought against God, then it brought great destruction to this earth and actually to the entire universe. Let's look at Isaiah 45, verse 18. It says, "For thus says the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He has established it. He created it not in vain." That's that same word that's used over in Genesis 1 and verse 2. One of the words for created it not in vain, the Hebrew word tohu. It says, "He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else." So that creation initially was a perfect creation. Now it wasn't completely finished, and this gets to the heart of what God had in mind for the angels, what they could continue doing in God's purpose and plan. It was an unfinished creation, but because God made it, it was beautiful, and there was a purpose for it as well. But it became in a state of decay, or it became wasted and empty because of rebellion. Notice what Herbert W. Armstrong wrote in a letter back on May 2nd, 1974. It says, "Now we come to the second verse in Genesis 1, that verse we just read. He says, 'The government of God, by which God preserves what he has created, had been removed from the earth.'" Once Lucifer rebelled, he means. God proposes to restore his government by and through man, finally redeemed through Christ and born into the God family. His dual purpose, remember, is to restore the government of God upon earth and to preserve it by means of reproducing himself in bringing man into perfect righteous character, ultimately born into the family of God. And so when Lucifer and those assigned to this earth failed in their mission, rebelled against God, and turned this earth and the universe into a state of waste and decay, then God enacted Plan B, which was to bring man into existence. Now I'll let you read on your own time Psalm 104 and verse 30, where it talks about what God did to renew the face of the earth. Now that's actually what happened in the rest of Genesis chapter 1. That's not speaking, except for verse 1, it's not speaking the rest of the chapter about the original creation of the universe. It's talking about when God renewed the face of the earth, when God prepared it for man's existence around 6,000 years ago. Let's look at Jeremiah 4. Again, just to get a little bit of background here as to why God created the material universe to begin with. There was a purpose for it. He had a plan in mind. Initially, the angels were to beautify and to maintain as they upheld the government of God. But a third of them, at least, failed in that mission, led by Lucifer, who rebelled and became Satan. Jeremiah 4, verse 19, this is the prophet of God now projecting ahead toward the end of this 6,000-year period of man's rule over this earth, under the sway of the devil. He's looking ahead, and notice Jeremiah, he says in verse 19, my bowels, I'm pained at the very heart. My heart makes a noise in me. I cannot hold my peace, it says, because you have heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Verse 20 talks about destruction upon destruction. That's coming at the end of this age. So many prophecies point to it. But notice the prophet says, verse 23, I beheld the earth. He's seeing this in vision now. He's seeing this as he looks ahead to the end of this age. He says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. There's that same phrase that we see in Genesis 1 and verse 2. It was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. This is what the prophet saw ahead. This is what the prophet saw would happen at the end of the age of man, even after God renewed the face of the earth and prepared it for man's existence. We see where it was to go after that because of man's rebellion as well. We don't have time to cover as much of that in this particular episode, but suffice it to say, Adam went the same course that Lucifer did before him. You can see that in Genesis chapter 3. But the reason why it's so important to go back to the very beginning here is you can see where it all started. And you can see why we're headed toward destruction again. Tohu and bohu, those Hebrew words in Genesis 1 and verse 2. And then again in Jeremiah 4 and verse 23. But as Isaiah brings out, God didn't create it to be that way in the beginning. It's happened though, whether because of the angelic rebellion or now because of man's rebellion. We see where it's headed because of rebellion against God's law. But so much besides just where we're headed can be revealed or can be learned and understood by going back to the beginning of the movie, so to speak. As I said there at the beginning, we've come into this right toward the end, and we need to go back as if in a time machine to see what happened at the very start. If we go back to the beginning of the movie, as Mr. Armstrong often said, then we can know and understand what God reveals for a number of things. For human beings, for men and women, for why he instituted the marriage relationship. As we'll see in just a little bit, we can see how this human civilization got started and where it went off track. And what it's leading to today. We can see how Satan the devil goes after mankind, the tactics that he uses, and embedded in those same passages of Scripture, revealed from God, is the incredible human potential, what God offered to man at the very beginning. Back to Genesis 1, let's look at verse 26. It says, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Now that recreation or that renewal of the surface of the earth, it's covered in those first 20 or 25 verses or so in Genesis chapter 1. But then when we get to verse 26, we see how God slows it down a bit and gives us much more detail after he talks about the creation of human beings. And there's of course a reason for that, because God made us to be in his likeness and image, as it says there in verse 26. God reveals that to us. He put us, if you read through the next couple of chapters, you see how God made us to be in His likeness and image. He put us in this special environment. In the case of Adam and Eve, in this special garden where they were to work and to maintain and to beautify, where the two of them together as husband and wife were to work together toward their high calling in that institution that God established from the very beginning, the marriage institution. Now in verse 26 there it says, and God said, and the Hebrew word for God there is Elohim. It's a noun or a name, plural in form, but normally it's used in the singular grammatical sense. It's the same kind of word as family or church or group. In the beginning, there was this group that made man. And of course, initially or early on, originally, that group consisted of God and the Word. You can see that over in John chapter 1 and verse 1. God and the Word. That's who brought man into existence. Mr. Armstrong wrote in Mystery of the Ages, it is referring to precisely the same persons making up or composing the one God as we found in John 1:1, the Word and God. And each of those two persons is God. He writes, in other words, God is now a family of persons composed so far of only the two, God the Father and Christ the Son. You can see that if you continue reading in John 1, where Jesus came in the flesh and became God's Son, and the two of them became a family. But back here in Genesis 1 and verse 26, where it says, let us make man, this is God and the Word speaking. Let us make man in our image. Our image, that word image, it means in the Strong's Concordance, resemblance or representative figure. We were made to resemble God. We were made to live like God, to be like God, and ultimately to become God. If you can believe it. Most people can't. But if you can believe it, that's what God reveals. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 45, it says, and so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. The first Adam was made a living soul. We'll see Genesis 2 and verse 7 in just a minute. And living soul just means a living, breathing, physical being. A breathing creature. A physical being. He just had a temporary existence in the flesh. But the second Adam, or the last Adam, was made a quickening spirit. And that's referring to Jesus Christ. The second Adam, who, when he was raised from the dead, he became a spirit being who lives even to this day and will live forever. Verse 46, howbeit, that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterward that which is spiritual. The first man is of the earth, earthy, Adam that is. The second man is the eternal from heaven. The first Adam was made a living soul. The second Adam, we might say, was made an eternally living spirit. A living spirit. Verse 48, as is the earthy, such are they also that are earthy, and as is the heavenly, such are they also that are heavenly. And as we have borne, this is the main verse I want you to take note of, verse 49, as we have borne the image of the earthy, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly. That word bear there in verse 49 means to, like you would put on a garment, like I put on this coat today. We are to wear the image of the heavenly, just like we wear the image of the earthy. If we were made in the flesh, which all of us were,